I'd like to thank my co-host and helper today, Trudy Marotta. Like me, Trudy is a volunteer community ambassador with ARP Virginia, and she'll be monitoring the chat box and the Q&A box. So on to our program. It is indeed my pleasure to introduce and welcome our guest speaker, Jim Lewis. Jim Lewis is a noted Civil War and World War II historian, lecturer, and tour guide. He has authored numerous historical landmarkers and been the keynote speaker for their dedications. In recognition of his many local historical contributions, he was once designated Lord Fairfax by the Hunter Mill District here in Fairfax County, Virginia. Today, Jim is telling us the story about Charles Russell Lowell, the Union Cavalry's exceptional battlefield commander during the American Civil War. If you're a history lover like me, you're in for a real treat. So please give a warm virtual welcome to Jim. And Jim, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the intro. Very, very nice. I presented about 4 months ago about Hunter Mill Road, which is in Northern Virginia. It's 7.2 miles long. It's really still a country road between Oakton, Virginia and Reston, Virginia. And the history on that road goes all the way back to the formation of Fairfax County, which was in 1742. So we had a really good time doing that. I got a lot of comments, some follow-up Q&A, and things went really well. It was a lot of fun. Hence, doing research with regards to the Hunter Mill Road corridor, I realized I had to expand my horizons and learn the history out of the area, although in a very near area, one of which was the town of Vienna. And when I was doing my research there, I came upon a cavalry brigade union that was headquartered on top of Ayr Hill, A-Y-R, and that's what Vienna used to be called before it was the town of Vienna, Ayr Hill, the village of. So anyway, as I did more and more research, particularly on that brigade, I learned about and really became infatuated with the Union cavalry commander named Charles Russell Lowell Jr. So anyway, he's not a nationally known figure, but I can guarantee you he is still revered in New England. And I believe you'll understand why after this presentation. So let me begin with a quick question of you. I don't need a response, obviously, but I would assume you've heard of the name and place Lowell. Does Lowell anywhere ring a bell? Well, there's a town in Massachusetts, and it's called Lowell, Massachusetts, and it's named for his family. So let's begin. Charles Jr., there he is on the left. 8 years old with his father, senior, and he was called Charlie Jr., or let's just say Jr. That's his mother, Anna, whose picture you see here right after the American Civil War. For 9 generations, their family had been principal players in both the business and social circles of the city. And I'm talking Boston, not just Lowell, Massachusetts. Sadly, Senior, right here, he lost the family fortune, basically, during the panic of 1837, which touched off a major recession lasting into the mid-1840s. Realizing he was not a businessman, he now spent his days preparing card catalogs for the local library. And his wife is the one that carried the family through. So she was the real strength of the family. Now, 1850, after 2 years of prep school, Charlie entered Harvard College at the age of 15. Here he is. He was ranked first in scholarship and stayed there. He was especially fond of philosophy, science, and literature. He graduated 4 years later, valedictorian at the age of 19. And I have to correct myself. This is his photo, his graduation photo at 19. His valedictory address was "The reverence due from old age to youth." And he argued the value of young men came from their ideas, not the physical labor. His plan now was to spend the next 10 years in business making enough money to rebuild their family finances and then devoted himself to public service. He could have obviously, with what I just said, had his pick of any job that he wanted, but he took a menial job as a laborer at a nearby iron mill to understand the working man's situation. Appalled by the terrible working conditions and squalor in which they lived, he began making plans for change when he would hold a position of authority, which he knew he would eventually. Seeing enough, he accepted a promising management position with an iron company in New Jersey. However, he was soon found coughing up blood, stricken with consumption. Now that's tuberculosis. Doctors recommended he move to a warmer climate without work for 2 years. Instead, he opted for a career change into what was supposedly a healthier environment, taking a job at JPM or JM Forbes and Company, which was a prominent investment firm. However, his health continued to deteriorate. Finally, he accepted doctor's orders and convalesced in Europe and North Africa for 2 years. Wherever he stopped, he learned the language and developed into an accomplished equestrian and proficient swordsman, skills that would later serve him well. His illness went into remission and he returned to the United States. Back here, he accepted an assistant treasurer and land agent position with the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad, and that was in southeast in Iowa. In his travels, he fell in love and bought 200 acres near Dixon, Illinois. Now, please remember that, because this presentation is going to come full circle, and you're going to hear about that property at the end. Realizing his passion for the iron industry, and by that I mean railroads, because back then railroads were a big deal. So to have a job with the railroad was pretty prestigious. He applied and became iron master at the Mount Savage Iron Works in Cumberland, Maryland. November 1860, Lincoln is elected. Now Lowell supports him, but Lincoln was a catalyst for secession. Even with the bombardment of Fort Sumter 5 months later, April 12, 1861, Lowell, a passive abolitionist, continued with his efforts to rebuild the family's finances. 1 week later, everything changed as this occurred. He was in Baltimore purely by coincidence and witnessed an angry mob attack his home state 6th Massachusetts volunteers while changing trains en route to Washington. And this is the Baltimore Riot. 4 were killed, 36 were wounded. He immediately went directly to Washington, D.C. to apply for a commission of second lieutenant of artillery in the regular army. He applied directly to Senator Charles Sumner, and he stated of his qualifications, you'll love this. This is New England arrogance. Quote, as being able to speak and write English, French, Italian, German, and Spanish, and know enough of mathematics to put me at the head of my class at Harvard. I am 26 years of age, and I believe I possess more or less moral courage about taking responsibility, which seems at the present to be found only in Southern officers. Can you imagine that coming out of his mouth? It did. His application was passed on to Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, who was struck by Lowell's youthful appearance and asked, what do you know of a horse? Lowell's response, quote, enough to take a hard day's work out of him and bring him in as fresh at night as any other man. Cameron was so impressed, particularly with Lowell's academic credentials, Now remember, he spoke 5 different languages, and the equestrian skills that he had acquired overseas, that he was commissioned a captain instead of a second lieutenant. And here he is as a captain of the 3rd, later the 6th Regiment of U.S. Cavalry. So proficient in training, he was rewarded with a command of a squad, which was 2 companies. Now, April 1862, and now this is the 2nd year of the war, or we've really come up on really the anniversary of Fort Sumter, if you will. The 6th is transported down to Fort Monroe, Virginia, for McClellans Peninsula campaign. And there, Lowell distinguishes himself leading saber charges at Williamsburg and Slatersville. For his performance, he's nominated for brevet to major within an earshot of the raging 7 days battle, and that's around Richmond. The 6th was encamped at Harrison's Landing. While there, Lowell took a deep personal loss as his younger brother, James, was wounded at Glendale, later dying on July the 4th. There he is. He was in the 20th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry. He was the 1st Louis, 1st Lieutenant. Here's McClellan. If you know anything about the Civil War, you know who this guy is. That's George. He noticed Lowell's nomination for promotion and brought him onto the staff. The work that Lowell was asked to do wasn't very glorious and kept him away from the fighting at 2nd Bull Run. However, things would again change on September 17th. Our nation's worst day occurred at Sharpsburg, aka Antietam Creek. From 6 to 9:30 a.m., there were 12,000 casualties, or 1 every second, with the battles in the cornfield and the East Woods. The entire battle took 12 hours. In essence, there were really 3 separate battles. And if you do the math, 23,000 casualties occurred over 12 hours, which means that there was a casualty every 2 seconds for half of the day. As Lowell was delivering orders for General Sedgwick's division in the West Woods, he found the line routed and in retreat. He immediately called for them to rally and stem the flow to the rear. For some reason, they chose to follow. A nearby officer recalled of Lowell, quote, "It seemed to me that no mounted man could have lived through that storm of bullets that swept the East Wood just after I saw him enter it." His horse was struck 7 times, and another bullet ripped through his overcoat, and a final ball stuck and shattered his scabbard. Miraculously, Charles himself was untouched. Never a braggart, even though he was very confident, as you know from the earlier quotes, he wrote a home letter to his mother, simply saying, quote, "I have had my usual good luck, but shall have to buy a new saber and shall have 1 horse less to ride for a month or 2. I mean, that's the way he wrote. By the way, he was a prolific writer, and that's why there's a lot on the internet about Charles Lowell Jr. And his wife, which you'll meet shortly. Learning about Lowell's actions that day, McClellan rewarded Lowell by giving him the coveted honor of presenting the 39 captured battle flags to the Secretary of War in Washington, D.C. Soon after the battle, Lincoln fires McClellan yet again. 2nd time he gets fired on November the 4th. Therefore, his staff is free. They return to their regiments and or look for new assignments. Now, what does Lowell do? Meanwhile, Governor Andrew of Massachusetts was looking to raise a 2nd Regiment of State Cavalry. Lowell came highly recommended to recruit, organize, and train the 2nd Massachusetts Cavalry. Governor Curtin was impressed and agreed without reservation. Now, recruiting was a real tough business in Massachusetts at that time. Lowell even had to shoot a mutinous ringleader after he had taken the oath of enlistment. Here's a poster, and there's Lowell inside the rectangle there of recruitment. Lowell also became involved in the recruitment of the 54th Regiment, Massachusetts Infantry, with his close friend, Robert Gould Shaw, and he's the colonel. And you, if you haven't heard about him, you'll hear shortly who he really was. Anyway, he was a commander of the 54th and also a prominent New England family, the Shaw family. The 54th was the first regiment of what they call Negroes raised in the North. And here's a recruitment poster, as I mentioned earlier. Ironically, the 54th's basic training was also held at Camp Meads, which was just outside of Boston. And guess who else was there? The 2nd Massachusetts. So they collaborated with each other, Gould and Lowell, in the training of these men. And the 2nd Massachusetts, I would like to mention that this fellow right here is J. Sewell Reed. And most of the 2nd Massachusetts Cavalry, they were the elite from California. As I mentioned, recruiting was really tough in Massachusetts at that time. So Sewell Reed came forward with a proposal which Governor Andrews accepted. And so the 1st Battalion got on a ship and came over and around, to Boston. And that's who the 2nd Mass was made up out of. Now, eventually, that was 100 men. It grew to be a battalion, which was 500 men, or 5 companies of 100 each. So they had really, really good, sharp men in that unit. They were all Californians, even though they were called the 2nd Mass Cavalry. So as fate would have it, Charlie and Rob attended a social event where Charlie became infatuated with Rob's sister, Josephine Effie, for short, E-F-F-I-E, Shaw, who was 10 years younger than the 28-year-old Lowell. There she is. That's his to-be wife. Josephine, this picture is of 1869. She was small, delicate, and beautiful. More importantly, she was the intellectual equal of Lowell. She was educated in Paris and Rome. Like Charlie, she had a deep love for literature and history. Effie simply reminded Charlie of his mother. Within 2 months, it was Charlie who had been recruited, and the two were engaged with a wedding date subject to, quote, military necessity. In other words, whenever they could get out and go get married. She even moved Camp Meigs with Lowell's mother in order to be near her hero and future husband. Now, by April, Lowell was formally appointed colonel and commander of the 2nd Mass Cav. Early May, with the loss of 17,000 at the Battle of Chancellorsville in Virginia, fresh troops were needed. Charlie and the rest of the 2nd Mass Cav were ordered to Camp Brightwood in Washington in support of the defenses of the capital. Close to the seat of war, Lowell continued to relentlessly prepare his men. His men noted that he was always there, going through the same exercises and drills, never tiring or sparing himself, always saving administrative details until the men were resting. It was on this duty that Charlie and Effie began to correspond on a daily basis, learning more about each other, and their love grew. And these letters are available. It's great to read these letters. On June the 10th, Lowell received orders to track down some guerrillas who had attacked and burned the 6th Michigan Cavalry's camp before disappearing into the Maryland countryside. The locals just said, quote, they disappeared, unquote. And it became obvious the guerrillas were hiding in the houses and farms they had passed. Now, anybody that's a student of the Civil War, you probably have an idea who this might be, but I will show you right now. Mosby. John Singleton Mosby, famous as a raider throughout the war. And this action on June 10th had initiated a year of conflict between Charlie and Mosby, which would see victories and defeats, but never Mosby's outright destruction. Mosby was a master, as I said, of hit and run operations and was nearly impossible to counter with conventional means. The only effective means of dealing with him was by way of the concept of total war, which had yet come to Northern Virginia. It would come about a year later, but not right now. Lee's retreat from Gettysburg provided Charlie his first taste of combat as a company officer, as he successfully engaged dismounted Confederate cavalry at Ashby's Gap, which is where Route 50 today goes through Bull Run Mountains, heading out of Leesburg, if you will, towards the Shenandoah Valley. Just 3 weeks after Gettysburg, which was July 1st through the 3rd, 1863, and the nation beginning to have some hope that the hostilities might end soon because it was an overwhelming Union victory. Tragedy struck again. This time, Effie was greatly affected. Remember I told you, if you're not familiar with Robert Gould Shaw, I would let you know. Well, here he is. July 28th, the 54th Mass was obliterated at the ill-fated assault of Fort Wagner in South Carolina. The regiment lost 272 of its 600 men charging the fort. Charlie had lost one of his closest friends, and that was Shaw, and Effie had lost her dear brother. Several letters back and forth between her and Charlie detailed Charlie's attempts to console Effie through this period. Here is a memorial. It's called the Shaw Memorial on the Boston Common in Boston. It was unveiled on Memorial Day, 1897. This is Robert Gould Shaw. And if you haven't figured this out yet, this is glory. One of the best Civil War movies ever made. And that is Broderick, Matthew Broderick. And let me see if I can catch his name. Yeah, Matthew Broderick. Some people, younger people, might know him as Ferris Bueller. Anyway, Denzel Washington, this is the first time you really see him. He wins everything. He's best supporting actor. And this fellow right here, he's been on TV so much, I really just refer to him as God. I mean, he's always the commander of everybody. And he's obviously a fantastic actor, still around. Just 3 days later, another clash with Mosby took place, and it became obvious that a concerted effort was needed to shut down the irregular operations, meaning the raiders, of which Mosby was part of. Washington responded by giving Lowell command of an independent cavalry brigade. And this included the 13th and 16th New York Cav and his own 2nd Mass Cav. Lowell welcomed the New Yorkers, although his own regiment, now these are the boys from the West Coast, they considered the newcomers, predominantly Germans and somewhat out of control, as, quote, so much excess baggage to be taken care of, unquote. Okay, we're in Vienna, Virginia, on top of Air Hill. There you go. That's the encampment. And you'll notice there's very few trees. Wherever the military goes, trees disappear, particularly back then, because wood was used for everything. And they were tasked with guarding the early warning line for Washington, D.C. So that line extended all the way out to basically today's Route 123 from Madera School in Great Falls all the way down through Flint Hill or Oakton, Fairfax Station down to the Occoquan. So anyway, what I wanted to show you here is, here's Lowell. Now he's short, just like Mosby. Most of your cavalry boys were short, and you can imagine why. I mean, they're on horses and they wanted agility. Remember this fellow right here. And this fellow is Surgeon Oscar C. DeWolf. Remember him, because I'm going to reference him a little bit later on. In August, Lowell got the upper hand on Mosby at Gooding's Tavern, which is was right across the street from today's Northern Virginia Community College, on Route 236 near Annandale. A second mass detachment put bullets in Mosby's thigh and groin, almost killing him. While Mosby recovered, Lowell concentrated on other guerrillas, much like Elijah White out of Loudoun County, and there were other groups. So, but by the fall, things were relatively calm. Finally, Charlie took leave because he had a chance to do so, and he went north on October 31st, Halloween, right? There they get married in New York, and there's Effie and Charlie, their wedding picture right here. A few days later, both Effie and Charlie go back to camp together in Vienna, and there they are, Charlie and Effie, on top of Air Hill in Vienna. This is a period picture taken then, and that would have been 1863. So right below it is the house, Air Hill, which is where they stayed, on top of the location, which was called Air Hill. So everything's Air Hill at that time. Daily patrols. And what did Effie do before I move on? Effie worked with Surgeon DeWolf and Chaplain Humphrey to tend to the sick and wounded in the hospital. She also endured herself to the officers and enlisted men by conversing with the Frenchmen, Italians, and Germans in their own languages. You can tell these are highly educated individuals. Daily patrols incurred continual conflict with Mosby's men and other irregulars. Lowell detested this work, though, because it really wasn't fighting. It was, in essence, what he called inglorious warfare or police work. However, Charlie was really good at it, just like everything he did. Periodically, he would adjust his tactics, but Mosby and his Rangers would adjust quickly because they were extremely intelligent too, and things would go back to business as usual. After the war, and this is a great quote, Mosby would write in his memoirs, quote, "I have often said that of all the federal commanders opposed to me, I had the highest respect for Colonel Lowell, both as an officer and a gentleman." Okay, early the following year, February, Lowell's organizational skills are recognized, and as a result, they sent him down to Giesboro Point Cavalry Bureau, and this is down there, Anacostia in DC, Washington, DC, where they asked him or ordered him to overhaul the system down there of processing horses. While he's there, he processed 20,000 plus horses. The end of March, Lowell was allowed to return to his brigade in Vienna. And here is Giesboro Point. There's the headquarters. There's some of the stockades, if you will. And he comes back to Vienna. While he was away, there was a tragedy. Struck yet again on February 22nd. Returning eastward from a Mosby hunting mission, a 150-man detachment of the 2nd Mass and the 16th New York Cav, including Sewell Reed, who you remember, were ambushed and routed by Mosby's Rangers. This is where that occurred. Up here, and this is right across the street from the Costco in Sterling, which would be over here, Route 7 coming right up here. This is Northern Virginia Community College, okay? And this is out there to this very day. And this is the family's house, the Yankers family, who were there the day of this attack. And there is a historical marker designating what occurred here. So anyway, this was devastating. 12 were killed in action, 25 wounded, 50 plus captured, with 35 later dying at Andersonville, Georgia. And here's a memorial that's right in the middle here. And this is what it says. You can read it. And that's where a number of the men were buried, right there on the campus property. So early July, Lowell is called on to assist in the defense of the nation's capital against Confederate General Juba Early's army when he had marched on Lee's orders up to DC and attacked at Fort Stevens, which is just on the edge of Washington, DC. Lowell's personal actions saved the Second Mass from annihilation in the streets of Rockville against 2 brigades of Early's retreating force. Late July, Charlie is finally called on for more important service, and Effie returned home, quote, 4 months pregnant. Now, there is no doubt in my mind that's where their daughter was conceived, right there. 4 months earlier, that's where they were. So anyway, Charlie's called on for this duty, and seeking an end to the war, Ulysses S. Grant significantly altered military objectives. If you remember, I earlier mentioned total concept of war. Sheridan implemented this, and that's Sheridan right there. He's the Union commander, this Jubal Early. He was the Confederate commander. And so he goes in with scorched earth, with a scorched earth policy, which resulted in the burning of the Shenandoah Valley. And that's the whole point of it, to go up there and wipe out the Confederacy's ability to propagate or continue the war, because the Shenandoah Valley was known as Route 95, north-south, for the Confederate Army, going between the northern and southern territories, as well as, more importantly, it was the breadbasket for the Confederacy and the Army. So anyway, this is when Sheridan learned of Lowell, excuse me, he quickly gave him a new cavalry brigade. And this is when Lowell truly began to shine. For weeks, Lowell's brigade maneuvered with the Army and fought almost every day. Sheridan was impressed with Lowell, as he always responded quickly and effectively. After a reorganization in the cavalry, he was rewarded by being given command of the Reserve Brigade, made up of the tough regular cavalry, which was comprised of the 1st, 2nd, 5th U.S., and 2nd Massachusetts units. It was considered to be the best in the service. The appointment was a high honor, and due to Lowell's exceptional abilities. September 19th, Sheridan's trust in putting the young volunteer in charge of the regulars paid off with big dividends during the Battle of 3rd Winchester, which is right here. And September 24th, Lowell excelled again in Luray Valley, prompting Sheridan. Now listen to this, because this is going to be something at the end. Sheridan requested a commission to Brigadier General for Lowell. Sadly, Lowell will never learn about this request. As the fighting continued into October with the burning, as I had mentioned previously, Lowell continued to excel. And this burning, by the way, they burned 1,000 mills, 2,000 barns, and 15,000 farm animals. Now, that was horrific. Lowell knew it was horrific. And the letters home to Effie indicate Lowell was horribly conflicted about this moral ambiguity. But he thought long-term, if this is what brings the war to an end, okay, so be it, we have to do it. Now, throughout the Valley campaign, Charlie had led a charmed life, like he had led before. He was never struck as men and horses. 13 of his own fell all around him. As the days of fighting wore on, he seemed to have a premonition, as revealed in letters to Effie, with comments like, quote, I should like to have Sundays quiet, and I do wish this war was over. Most telling of all, quote, I don't want to be shot till I have a chance to come home. I have no idea that I shall be hit, but I want so much not to now that it sometimes frightens me, unquote. It was not to be. October 19th, General Early's supposedly beaten Confederate army turned around and launched one of the most daring and successful flanking attacks of its kind against Sheridan's ill-positioned army at Cedar Creek, which is just south of Winchester, Virginia, in a town called Middletown. Now, this shot I took, and this is one of the reenactments up at Cedar Creek. This battlefield is renowned. It's one of the most popular battlefields for reenactors because you can actually reenact on the battlefield. It's illegal to reenact on US government property. Therefore, this property is owned by a foundation that's local there. So reenactors really love going to this, and they can really, live out what they want to live out. Anyway, Sheridan, the reason why the army was ill-positioned was that Sheridan wasn't on the battlefield, as he had spent the night in Winchester, having just returned from a conference in Washington, D.C. At 5 a.m., Early struck and in short order crushed two of the Union Army corps. Lowell and the Cavalry established a position at the extreme left where the brunt of the attack occurred in order to stabilize the line and buy time until Sheridan arrived back on the battlefield. There he is, that's Sheridan coming back from Winchester to Middletown, or where the battle is. And this is the real deal. This marker right here, this is Route 11, called also the Valley Pike. Up here is Winchester. Down here is Strasburg, and on down south of the, going down the valley. This is what the Valley Pike looked like at the time. So that's a period picture back then. Oh, anyway, Lowell's men withstood 3 successive charges. Yet he loses yet another horse. That's the 14th. On the 3rd charge, a bullet careened off a nearby stone wall and slammed squarely into Lowell's chest, but did not penetrate. A mushroom piece of lead was found nearby. Reeling in his saddle, he was helped to the ground. Dizzy, deprived of voice, sapped of strength, and with blood on his lips, he said, quote, "It is my poor lung. I have not lost a drop of blood yet. I want to lead in the final charge." Now, most likely the bullet had really collapsed one of his tubercular lungs, and he was bleeding internally. At 4 p.m., the order came for the counterattack, and Lowell said, which was a joke, but he said it, "I am well now." Too weak to mount his saddle without assistance, he was lifted and strapped into a saddle and rode to the front of 3,000 cheering cavalrymen. He summoned his strength, drew his sword, and whispered to an aide to sound the charge. The bugles gave the signal, and they rode rapidly towards the Confederates. Immediately, just as they were in the thickest of the fire from the town, a cry arose, "The colonel is hit." Now, this is how well known Lowell is during the Civil War. When you get a print of you as a centerpiece in the print, you're a big deal. There's Lowell. And he got taken out by a sniper up on this Brinker, called the Brinker House. This is Route 11, right here. That's the charge. And this print was done by a very famous illustrator at the time called J.E. Taylor. And this is the Union's final cavalry charge. Lowell fell from his horse and was carried on a litter behind his men. The counterattack was successful and the village of Middletown was retaken. Charlie was moved to a house in the village where, here we go, Dr. DeWolf, you remember him, tended to him. Here we are in Middletown. Here's the house. It's still there where Lowell was taken. Ironically, and this is what's really kind of part of what's really sad, Lowell's commission as Brigadier General of Volunteers was signed this very day. He was 29 years old and still not aware of his promotion. Here is Dr. DeWolf's account of Charlie's last hours. And remember, he was a surgeon. He was with Lowell the whole time, through all the battles and everything. Here's what he said. There were 4 or 5 in the room. Lowell lay on the table, shot through the shoulder to shoulder. The ball had cut the spinal cord on the way. Of course, below he was completely paralyzed. 4 others were lying desperately wounded on the floor. One young officer was in great pain. Lowell spent much of his ebbing strength helping him through the straits of death. When he heard the groans of the rebel wounded that were brought into the yard, he sent me away to look at them. As the night of the 19th wore on and his strength failed, DeWolf told Lowell, "Colonel, you must write your wife." He answered that he was not able, but I said it could be managed. So putting a scrap of paper on a piece of board, I held his arm above him, putting a pencil between his fingers and holding the hand against the paper, told him that I thought he could use his fingers. And thus he wrote a word or two of farewell to Effie. Lowell spoke less and less often. The following morning, 8 a.m., October 20th, Charles Jr. ceased to breathe the air of the earth, and Dr. DeWolf pronounced him dead. Here is a report by Sheridan to Grant of the casualties. There's Lowell, almost immediately mentioned right after Thoburn, who, by the way, their descendants lived on Hunter Mill Road, believe it or not, the Thoburns. Here's where this was written. This is Belle Grove Mansion. That's what it looks like today. And that's where Sheridan was stationed. This was the headquarters out there for Sheridan during this battle. Lowell's loss was felt deeply within the brigade and the Army's high command. General George Custer openly wept when saying, quote, "We all shed tears when we knew we had lost him. It is the greatest loss the Cavalry Corps ever suffered." General Sheridan remarked, "I do not think there was a quality which I could have added to Lowell. He was the perfection of a man and a soldier." Another high-ranking official said, I do not think there was any other officer in the Army so much as beloved as Lowell. October 28th, Lowell's funeral was held at Harvard Chapel in Cambridge with appropriate military honors. And today, this is where he is buried. This is one of the prettiest cemeteries on earth. I've been there. And I took some of these pictures. As a matter of fact, I took these 2 pictures. And this is the Lowell family plots with 15 immediate and extended members. Now, this place is a veritable who's who attended the funeral and who's buried here. But some of the folks that attended the funeral, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Julia Ward Howe, who wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, his uncle, James R. Lowell, who was a very well-known ambassador, author, playwright. I mean, it was just packed with notables. If Charlie had to give the ultimate sacrifice during the war, he would have probably deemed the Battle of Cedar Creek worthy. And this is incredible, if you're not aware of this, it's true. This saved Lincoln. I'll just net it out. Lincoln was done. He was not going to win the next election against this guy. And guess who that is? The guy he fired twice, George McClellan. He was running against Lincoln because the country had worn out with this war. And Lincoln knew he was going to lose. He wrote his concession speech and put it in his desk drawer. However, 2 victories happened within 2 weeks of the election: the Battle of Cedar Creek and the fall of Atlanta. And that saved Lincoln. Without that, he was done. This country would have gone a totally different direction if those things had not occurred within that kind of time frame. So it's really amazing when you think about history and what can you learn from it. And it's the conundrums are amazing when you start to piece things together. From Lowell's point of view, this so-called peace that McClellan would have sued for and signed up for would have rendered pointless all that his kinsmen had died for. So revered was Lowell that his admirers placed this memorial right in front of the Wayside Inn, which is very historic. This goes back to 1797, right across the street from where he died. Lowell's house, or the house that Lowell died in, was right across the street that I just showed you here previously, right here, directly across the street. So he was memorialized back in Cambridge. I took this picture. I tried to get into this hall, but their security shut me down twice. So this picture is a period picture of this in 1878. And this hall is called the Annenberg Dining Hall. And if you haven't noticed, there are niches alongside this dining hall, of which one includes Junior, Charlie. And because Lowell's star as Brigadier General did not reach him before his death, Chaplain Charles A. Humphreys, who was also with him, with DeWolf, the entire time that they were with Second Mass, suggested to the sculptor to, quote, put it in a spray of laurel under his bust, and there it may be seen. So to this very day, there's a general star in that niche in this hall. Now, many have asked me, what happened to Effie? And this is incredible. Barely a month after Charlie's funeral, Josephine gave birth to their only child. Named for her father, she would never know. She was called Carlotta after Charlie. Josephine spent the rest of her life as a widowed mother, never remarried, and dressed every day in black. Now, she was something else. She decided to honor the deaths of her brother, Robert Gould Shaw, and Charlie by becoming a social reformer. In 1874, she and Carlotta moved to Manhattan, where she became deeply interested in the social problems in New York City. She spent the next 35 years visiting prisons and poorhouses, campaigning for parks and better schools, and fighting for civil service reform and the rights of workers. And 2 years later, 1876, she was the first woman appointed to the New York State Board of Charities. 6 years later, 1882, she was the founder of the New York City Charity Organization Society, which gave form and direction to all the efforts of distinguished philanthropists in the city and beyond. And she guided that organization for 25 years. 1890, this is amazing. She established the New York Consumers League, her most wide-ranging and effective organization, which dealt with women's rights and working conditions. And it was adopted as chapters in many other cities across the country. Here's a bas relief of Josephine in 1899. Sadly, in 1905, at the age of 61, Josephine Shaw Lowell died of cancer at her home in New York City. Her memorial attracted hundreds of people and at least 50 eulogies, as well as numerous articles in daily newspapers and so on and so forth. So respected was Effie that the Josephine Shaw Lowell Memorial in Bryant Park, and this is behind the New York Public Library, was dedicated shortly after her death. Now, this is a picture 1934, and that's her fountain, and that's a current picture of her fountain. This was the city's first public memorial dedicated to a woman. So she was something else. Now, the daughter, here's Carlotta. This is 1888. She lived with Josephine, or Effie, and never married. Remember, here we go. I'm bringing it full circle. Remember that 200 acres that I mentioned earlier that her father bought while working for the Burlington, Missouri River Railroad Company? 1906, just 1 year after her mother died. She, in memory of her parents, Carlotta donated that land to the city of Dixon, and that's in Illinois. And it became a nature sanctuary and known as Lowell Park. This is the signature building or structure, and this is made out of all native stone and wood, and it's called Woodcote College. Now, Dixon residents made good use of this park over the years, but between 1926 and 1933, it employed a little-known lifeguard at the time at the Rock River Beach, and he's shown here on the cover of the Lowell Park book. I'm going to have to ask you any clue, and I know you know. You got it. Ronald Reagan, our 40th president, and he was reported to have saved 77 people from the river during his tenure. Okay, we're going to wrap this up. Closure. Carlotta died on September 19th, 1924, and was laid to rest with her parents. And here she is. And that's where Charles and Josephine are buried. They're all together in the Lowell plot up in the St. Albert Cemetery. Charles and Josephine had become, quote, the useful citizens they had privately expressed in their letters to each other. He threw duty on the battlefield, and she learned to perform as a citizen. Never desiring a military life, Charlie had been drawn into the nation's conflict through an inert sense of duty. He was a born cavalier, high-spirited, quick, flashing his plans into instant orders and pushing his orders to prompt execution. Yet, with all of this dashing, chivalrous spirit, he was always calm and self-possessed, unique traits. I'm sure you would agree, particularly when combined. He led from the front, and his men readily followed. His superiors admired his intellect, leadership, and bravery. There is little doubt his qualities were coveted by both sides of the conflict. One can only imagine what he might have achieved had he survived the war. It's been my honor and privilege to have presented the Charles Russell Lowell Jr. story. Thank you all very much. I appreciate your time and consideration.
Wow, Jim, that was absolutely excellent. And some of the comments in the chat room and the Q&A echo that. Excellent presentation. First question I have for you is, do you have any recommendations or suggestions regarding books about Effie?
Effie?
Yes.
Well, I tell you the best one that, let me pick one off my shelf here. That's the benefit of doing Zoom, right? Okay, can you see this? Now, this pretty much tells the whole story.
Am I reading that correctly? The nature of sacrifice? Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
That's it. And this is extremely well done. There are many others, and there are a lot of articles. You can even go on the website and look up 2nd Massachusetts Cav, and you'll see some of the pictures that I showed today in the slideshow and everything. But he is very well documented. Nobody knows about him. I mean, he's not Sheridan, he's not Sherman, he's not Grant, he's not Lee. Those are the people you hear about and all of that. But this is a really good book that includes everything. That's what I would highly recommend.
I'm looking through the chat room. Jim, do you have a end screen that has an email or contact information for you?
There you go. You know, last time I shamelessly did this, but you asked for it, so I'm going to shamelessly do it again.
Well,
I do a tour that I've done 60 times here locally, and it is Vienna, it is Hunter Mill Road, and it's all about the history and particularly the Civil War and all of that. And so it's something I do twice a year. But there's my email address if you'd like to get in touch with me. You'll notice that the email address is related to Antietam. I was so blown away when I learned about what happened at that battle. I said, I've got to grab it if I can. So I hope that helps.
okay. Yep, I'm sure it does. All right, this I may stump you with this question. Do you know the maiden name of Charles Jr.'s mother?
No. And I bet you it's in here. How's that for dancing?
Okay.
I bet you it's in here. You know, if you want, I could email that to Amber. She can email it out to somebody. I could do a little research on it.
Okay.
But I don't know it offhand.
All right. I'm sure probably Wikipedia has it as well. And Amber, can I call you into the screen? We had one question about where and when the recording of this will be available.
Yes, thanks, Trudy. If you've registered with us and we have your email address, then we will send a recording follow-up tomorrow.
Very good. Looks like one of our participants says that the maiden name of the mother might be Jackson. Does that sound familiar, Jim?
No.
Okay.
It doesn't. I'm not saying it's not right.
Okay, I'll do one more quick question and I'll give it to Suba to close. And that is, what is currently on the property of Air Hill?
That's a great question. It's houses, quite frankly, and the houses that are on the hill, particularly up top, they know what they have there. And they have as a result, they have an annual picnic in commemoration of that hill and what occurred on that hill. It's really cool. And if you know where to look, you can see, I know where the stones are for the foundation of the Air Hill house. And that house was built in 1767.
Excellent.
So it's, you know, Vienna was, it was Air Hill through like March or so of 1862. So it wasn't until, you know, the first year of the Civil War was over with it, it was officially called and got a post office with the name Vienna. Which is another great story all by itself, and I won't go there right now.
We have to have you back to tell us that story. Okay.
Well,
That is all I have in questions. We do
Okay.
have a survey in the chat box. So if you would take a minute to answer the survey for us so we know what other programs we can bring to you. And Suba, I'll turn it back to you.
All right, thanks, Trudy. Jim, before I start my closing comments, the start of your presentation, the Baltimore Riot, I'd heard a little bit about it, and I never knew that that was Charles's impetus or thing to get involved. What caused the Baltimore Riot?
Well, it was the troops that were being called in by Lincoln because the war had started. It's not the 75,000. Well, he did. He called up 75,000 as a result of Fort Sumter. So these were part of those troops that were coming into this area to support the war effort and defend Washington. And, you know, that all eventually led to First Manassas, because that was full of first state militia people. We almost had no army as a country at that point in time. I think we only had about 11,000 people in the army. And so Lincoln, he called up 75,000, almost all of them were militia. And they were part of the, you know, kind of the militia, if you will.
All right, thank you. Well, on behalf of ARP Virginia, I'd like to again thank our guest speaker, Jim Lewis. That was fantastic for sharing his valuable time and knowledge with us this afternoon. One small tidbit I picked up that Jim talked about that I never knew. I thought Lincoln was always a shoo-in for the second term. And Jim, you mentioned if General McClellan would have run for president, that Lincoln would have not won. I never knew that.
Absolutely correct. The problem was after Gettysburg, everybody thought the war was going to be ending. Now that's July 1863. When did Lee finally surrender? You know, April 9th, 1865. It was almost 2 years.
Yeah.
And it was what they called the Overland Campaign. And that's when Lincoln pulled Grant in from the west, from Mississippi. He took over the army. He rode really with, what's his name? The commander of the Army of the Potomac, George, I'm losing it right now. But anyway, they were told, and Grant really prosecuted the war. And what they did, this was a continuation of that total war concept. And they fought a number of battles wearing out Lee in Virginia, of which Cold Harbor was one. And there are all sorts of the Wilderness. I could go on and on. Every battle, there was about 30,000 men lost. Now, the Union could afford to lose them. Lee couldn't. Lee knew it. Grant knew it. And so they finally withered on the vine. And that's pretty much what happened. So because of that, the blood and the carnage kept going for well over a year with this Overland Campaign in 1864. And that's when the, just like right now, what happens to the United States when they get tired of something.
Wars,
You know?
tired of wars, right?
It's
Well, like Trudy, yeah, sorry, Jim, go ahead.
That's it. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Well, like Trudy said, we would love to get your feedback on today's program and ideas for future programs. In the chat box, you'll see a link to survey that Amber has put out. And then please click on the link and take a few moments to share your feedback with us, because we do take these surveys very seriously. We'll also send this link in a follow-up email later today. And Amber will post the links for the survey and the RSVP in the chat box when, and of course, she's already posted that. We also hope to see all of you next week for our next program of Tuesday Explorers. On Tuesday, 27 July at 3 o'clock, we're going back to our roots and exploring the life and times of AARP's founder, Dr. Ethel Percy Andrus. And you're most welcome to join us. There's a link to RSVP for it in the chat box. Well, folks, until then, stay curious and keep exploring. And Jim, thanks again for your time today.
You're very welcome. Always a pleasure with AARP. And nice meeting you too. Okay,
Yes.
take care. See you, Judy.
Bye, Jim.
Okay, bye-bye. See you, Amber.